Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next edition of CNF Talks. Today I have with me Anton Root, who's the co-founder and head of research at Allied Offsets. Anton's going to be joining us to speak at the International Carbon Market Summit, which is being held in London on the 14th of October. Welcome, Anton.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you with us. There's been a lot of debate in the press and elsewhere about the voluntary carbon markets and there being a need to improve the integrity of those markets. And obviously, the ICVCM and the VCMI have been working on how to improve the integrity. How are corporates, in your experience, reacting to the move towards high integrity credits in the VCMs?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. Yeah, of course, quality and integrity and trust have been at the very top of the agenda over the last, especially 2 years, but even prior to that. And really, what everybody wants is for these credits to be, a ton of carbon. That's fundamentally what this is meant to be, and a credit
Yeah.
is meant to represent a ton of emissions reduced or removed from the atmosphere. Now, on the corporate side, we're seeing corporates really moving, further upstream. So they're getting much more involved with investing in projects themselves, partnering with organizations to get really involved in the projects earlier on, and perhaps securing offtake agreements into the future, rather than relying on existing supply of credits today, which of course we've seen lots of negative stories about. So that's been one of the main ways that corporates have responded. Some have also chosen to source credits from more novel projects, so things like direct air capture or biochar, enhanced rock weathering, etc. Those types of projects and those credits are seem to have greater quality and more integrity, but of course they're much more expensive. So we haven't seen a huge shift to those credits yet,
Mm.
just given the price. But some corporates certainly have really doubled down on those credits.
Mm. And when we talk about the corporates, are we really talking about the largest companies? So how does this market segment? Is it really the I don't know, the Microsofts and the BPs of this world, or does it go down to a smaller size?
Yeah, it's really quite varied. We track about 14,000 companies that are or that have ever bought credits in this market, and they really
Yeah,
range from the biggest sort of emitters that you can think of, the BPs, the Shells, etc.,
yeah, yeah.
to airline companies, telecoms firms, and then, of course, some of the biggest tech firms as well.
Mm.
But then on the other hand, you have sort of mom and pop shops as well. You
Mm.
have some companies offsetting for the emissions of products that they're putting out, and these are small companies. So it's really quite varied, and I think that that kind of broadens the appeal of the market, because it's not just the large emitters or certain sectors of the economy. It's really corporates that are trying to do a good thing and trying to offset their emissions, and it really spans the entire gamut of the biggest to the smallest.
Okay. And obviously, with your business model, you're standing between, I suppose, the project developers and the corporate buyers. So, how do you address the lack of standardization and transparency in the market through the services that you offer?
Yeah, so Allied Offsets, we launched about 4 years ago now, and
Mm.
we have a database of over 30,000 projects from 25 different registries, as well as projects that aren't on registries yet. So we really track the entire cycle of, in some cases, investment in projects and project developers, all the way
Mm.
through sort of the registration, the actual activities, so the issuances of the credits by projects as they are undertaking their activity, And then finally, the sort of sale and the retirement of credits, and price dynamics and everything involved with that. So yeah, the market is, I would say there's in some cases or in some ways there's more transparency than what people think. I mean, at the end of the day, you can go into the registry pages and find hundreds of pages of documents, around the projects and the verification reports and the auditing activity and everything like that. And, in a lot of ways, that's more transparency than what you would find, in many other sectors of the economy.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
having said that, clearly, given that carbon credits are such an intangible product, I mean, you can't hold one, you can't see one. Really, it's just numbers on a screen. I think
Yeah.
that extra level of transparency and integrity is really required. Otherwise, this whole thing comes falling down.
I read with interest, I think it was on your website, that you recently set out to assess biodiversity as a co-benefit of carbon projects. How does that work in practice?
Yeah, good question. So, a lot of projects in the nature-based space, they're either looking to preserve and conserve nature or forests,
Yeah.
or restore forests, whether that's reforestation projects, afforestation, or peatland restoration, mangrove restoration, things like that.
Mm.
Now, and some of those projects may be doing a lot of great work on the carbon side. So planting trees and sequestering the carbon, which is necessary for us to avoid the worst potential cases of climate change. But they may not necessarily be helping from a biodiversity perspective. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. At the end of the day, this is a carbon market. This is carbon that these projects are meant to sequester. But of
Yeah.
course, some projects are doing a better job and they're planting, native trees, or they're just conserving areas of the planet that are more rich from a biodiversity perspective. So,
I see. Yeah.
what we're looking to do is essentially highlight the ones that are doing, the really good work and that are that are protecting really, rare species and are in areas that are incredibly rich from a biodiversity perspective. And if you're a buyer in the carbon market today, it's really hard to distinguish which projects
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
those versus which ones are, perhaps again still doing a great job from a carbon perspective,
Mm.
but may not necessarily have that same biodiversity impact.
Mm. Well, I'm sure that there's huge demand if you can cover both aspects through the credit that you're buying. Do share with us your thoughts about how the voluntary carbon markets and the mandatory, the compliance markets, are likely to evolve. Do you see that there will be greater convergence between them over time, with carbon credits perhaps being used in the voluntary carbon credits being used in the compliance markets and so on? Do you think ultimately that there will be a merging of these markets?
Yeah, I think that's where the market is certainly heading. So we're seeing lots of different governments worldwide either introducing regulation around carbon taxation or emission trading systems, which
Yeah.
allow for a certain percentage of the sort of obligation to be met through voluntary credits. So either that's being introduced or existing schemes are being amended with an eye towards accepting some of those credits. It's already happening in places like California, Colombia, South Korea, South Africa, many others, and places like Taiwan are looking to introduce that type of scheme today, as are countries like Singapore. So it's happening. I think the real question is whether the quality of these projects will be deemed to be high enough to meet the bar that the regulators will want to see. So again, I think it really comes back to, can we prove that, or can we trust that a ton of carbon is a ton, or even in a case where we say, well, maybe this project overissued credits, but they overissued it by, 50%, so you just need to buy more credits to account for that. I mean, I think some sort of system like that, I
Yeah.
think would bring certainly more accountability and more transparency to the market.
And do you think, just final question, looking towards the future, there have been a few leader pieces. The World Trade Organization, for instance, was talking about the need for carbon pricing. We see the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that the EU and the UK are introducing. Do you think all of these, ultimately, with the patchwork of systems of the voluntary carbon markets, the compliance markets, a push towards some other forms of carbon pricing, do you think ultimately that holy grail of a unified carbon price will materialize, or do you think that's simply not necessary to achieve the ends that everybody wants?
I mean, it's a great question. I think from my point of view, as someone who is has trained to be an economist, certainly I think a carbon price would be a great way to mitigate climate change. Of course, it's not the only option, but I think it's one that is that is quite feasible.
Yeah.
I really hope that we are going to be able to get there. I think in the next couple of years, this market hasn't really faced a big downturn. I don't think we've seen really a recession over the last 4 years when this market really started to sort of take off once again, sort of as a second wave that we're seeing today. And I really hope that as at some point, recessions are inevitable, and at some point it will happen. And I really hope that, companies and governments do not pull back from some of the commitments that they're making today, because, it's easy to cut sustainability initiatives as the first thing you cut, right? And to jettison plans for taxing corporates more when they're already hurting. And that's, of course, understandable, but there's definitely a trade-off that can be thought about here. And if we're moving into an era when pollution is accounted for and polluters must pay, then we really need a carbon price, whether that's through credits or taxes or some sort of ETS. We need that to really take hold. Otherwise, there's really no incentive for people to stop polluting.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Anton. For our viewers, if you'd like to hear more on these issues and related issues, please do come along to the event in person. It's being held in London on the 14th of October, the International Carbon Market Summit. We'd love to see you there. Further information on our website, citizenfinancial.com. So do look there and book your ticket. Anton, thank you very much indeed for sharing those thoughts today.
Thanks for having me.